This meeting to order. I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 18 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on the Status of Women. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders, and members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. A few comments for the benefit of our witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. Since everybody's in the room, if you want to speak, raise your hand, and a reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. Thank you for your cooperation. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, September 15th, 2025, the committee will resume its study of anti-feminist ideology. Before we welcome our witnesses, I would like to provide a trigger warning. We'll be discussing themes and experiences related to anti-feminist ideology. This may be triggering to viewers with similar experiences. If any participants feel distressed or need help, please advise the clerk. And for all witnesses and all members of Parliament, it's important to recognize that these are difficult discussions, and so let's try to be compassionate in our conversations. Now I'd like to welcome our witnesses. Nous avons Marie-Yves Carignan.
Marie-Yves Carignan, tenured professor and UNESCO chair in Preventing Radicalization and Violent Extremism from the University of Sherbrooke.
Dr. Lisa Lorenzetti, associate professor, Faculty of Social Work from the University of Calgary. Nous commencerons par les déclarations.
We will begin with opening remarks. First, with Madame Carignan. You have 5 minutes. I'll go. Thank you. Thank you, Chair and members of the committee. I'm happy to be here. So I'll talk about our work at the UNESCO Chair in preventing radicalization, and I'll talk about the media and give you some suggestions. The UNESCO Chair is interested in anti-feminism, so a backlash movement against feminism and associated with manosphere that includes men rights activists, pickup artists, men going their own way, and incels, among others. There are many reasons why we're looking into this. First, the manosphere promotes violent and hateful discourse that can bring to suicide and hate crimes, among other things. Here are some of our research communities. They allow us to work on anti-feminism. We do online monitoring, and our personnel looks into different communities and different influencers, as well as the discourses that those influencers peddle. We also work to better understand international initiatives with the aim of preventing radicalization, notably related to LGBTQ plus homophobia. We also give many conferences and trainings on misinformation. We work with unions and other actors, and we talk about the rise of anti-feminism. And we train them to better deal with this phenomenon. My colleague, David Moran, told you this Monday, that we rolled out a poll with the statement that feminism was a strategy to allow women to control society. And mostly young Anglophone men agreed with it. And a recent poll in France showed that young men are very influenced by the manosphere. I'll highlight something else that came out of that study. The number of those who aren't sure about their response is on the uprise, whereas those who said yes is stable. So it went from 6.7% to 11.2% for those who aren't sure. So that goes along with an overall trend. And that shows that we need to avoid a potential trend of misinformation. Social media is particularly important in giving visibility to influencers who come from the manosphere. who promote sexist ideas. Social media can create communities that can create an echo chamber of anti-feminist views. Youth are mostly exposed to these influencers. Around 60% of youth follow at least one influencers online. Before, these were communities on the margins, but now they're becoming mainstream. Faced with this, traditional media plays a really important role because they can inform society and political decision makers and parents, but they have to do it the right way. They need to highlight experts and be very careful when they promote or cover Meninist influencers. And they need to avoid mainstreaming hateful attitudes. There's been an evolution in how journalism covers these things. For instance, using the term feminicide when a woman is murdered. This leads me to my recommendations. First, the importance of traditional media. We need to better fund traditional media and offer training to journalists. We need a regulatory framework for hate speech online and protect youth from negative effects of social media. We need to prevent misinformation consumption online and include ideas about gender equality in education and fund research in order to do online monitoring and analyze discourses and ecosystems. Thank you. Thank you.
Dr. Lorenzetti, and you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me. Merci beaucoup. I am a settler of Italian heritage, born on the lands of the Ginekahaka Mohawk people. For 30 years, I've lived on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot and Treaty 7 nations and acknowledge the original caretakers of this land. I am honored to present on Anishinaabe territory, whose Kind Man initiative, rooted in the 7 grandfather teachings, is an inspiring example of men's violence prevention engagement and a blueprint that we can all learn from. The heart of my work is grounded in confronting the ongoing legacies of colonialism, patriarchy, and racialized systems that shape the social issues we face today. I'm here with the support of my community. Anti-feminist ideology is not new. A defining moment of my life was as a McGill student on December 6, 1989, when 14 women were separated from men and murdered at École Polytechnique Université de Montréal because there was and still is a societal permission to resent women, propel men's victimhood despite raising rates of domestic and sexual violence against women and girls, and a cult-like approval for male authoritarianism. I was among those who reclaimed the campus, despite threats of harm. However, like many settlers, I was ignorant of the thousands of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls and Two-Spirit who received no justice, no media attention, and acknowledgement that their lives matter. These experiences marked my understanding of how misogyny and colonialism are weaponized. Anti-feminism has always included racist, homophobic, transphobic, and colonial ideologies and rigid, theocratic interpretations of gender roles. Today, this is amplified to our youth through economic insecurity, climate crisis, political polarization, and the digital world where misogyny generates enormous profits. Young people, particularly young men who feel disconnected, unrepresented, or anxious about the future, are targeted. As a university educator and mentor, I witnessed Gen Z's anxiety and feelings of hopelessness through my students. Its depths is reflected in the words of my 17-year-old who told me that young people turn to screens because the real world is terrifying. This fear is underscored in Galway's and Field's Canadian study on youth and climate anxiety, where 73% viewed the future as frightening and nearly half agreed, and I quote, "Humanity is doomed." With increasing youth unemployment, now at almost 15%, and recent Ipsos study shows that 80% of Canadian youth view home ownership as only for the rich. As older adults, we must ask ourselves what we are doing to create spaces of hope, compassion, equity, relational accountability, and opportunity, particularly for marginalized youth. Across 35 years of social work, supporting women and children impacted by intimate partner violence, war, systemic racism, and economic deprivation, I have seen firsthand that anti-feminist ideology is deeply woven into structures that withhold economic well-being, impose gender tropes, police gender diversity, and sanction violence. Namely, the most pervasive and least addressed forms, as I've said, is against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit. Lack of progress on the 231 calls to justice is impacting not just Indigenous youth, but non-Indigenous youth as well, and we have some recommendations on that. My primary prevention research focuses on community-based, culturally resonant, peer-led groups that integrate well-being as a violence prevention approach in programs with men, women, and families. This intersectional research, co-led with ethnocultural communities, is rooted in community strengths. In 2020, we launched the Transforming Masculinities International Community of Practice, now across 11 regions. It amplifies the need for holistic community-based solutions with cultural grounding, the benefits of youth engagement through nurturing fatherhood and role modeling, and the necessity to address systemic issues, not just individual behaviors. The question of what's happening with men, Gen Z men, was explored last summer through a small-scale survey in Alberta, mostly with Alberta men, co-conducted with social work student Charles Panabaker. Some notable findings: 54% received messages about gender primarily online, but less than 10% feel that influences are their main resources. 80% report having positive role models, but only 25% have someone that they can talk to about their struggles. Only 42%, and this is important, 42% support gender equality, and only 46% believe in creating safe spaces for women. 83% say that gender issues are too politicized. These findings suggest a greater need for connection, belonging, representation, and accountability, which can increase the vulnerability to digital misogyny, extremist narratives, and anti-female ideology, which is in the manosphere, amplified by influencers who, in fact, profit in the capitalist system from fear and polarization.
I'm sorry to interrupt. And that's the end of your time. The rest of it, I'm sure that you will be able to get in the questions. If not, anything that you want to send to the clerk, we're happy to hear from. We're going to start our first round of questions with Madame Vien for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses, Madame Carignan and Madame Lorenzetti. Thank you for being here. Madame Carignan, thanks for your opening remarks. We're also looking for solutions. You gave us a few recommendations. What can the Canadian government do specifically to prevent meninism and anti-feminism? Many things. I tried to highlight the fact that you have to work on social media. How can we better regulate online hate speech? A lot of that discourse is violent, and when there's violent hate speech online, well, we must prevent it. The government needs to have comms campaigns and fund research in order to better understand that research, in order to develop strategies, in order to do pre-bunking. Can you explain what that is in 30 seconds? It's explaining to people what kind of misinformation or violent messaging they can be exposed to, so then they'll know what those messages are when they encounter them. I'm a former journalist. Your first recommendation is to better train journalists. So first, to fund media. The media has a role to play. They have to talk about this issue as a social issue. The media ought to be trained in order to not give platforms to certain players. So, for instance, in Tout le monde en parle, was it a good idea to invite people who agreed with that? We are often asked that. I think they had to talk about the issue, about the manosphere. However, I think they should have found a better balance, and there was social pressure to invite a certain person. And after he went on that TV show, he got a lot more followers. So you have to be careful. You have to be careful about inviting people to mainstream media. They can have more extreme discourse on their platforms. And do you think those media platforms have to take responsibility? Well, right now I think they need more funding and they need resources. We were told that teachers were overwhelmed by the situation. I assume that parents are as well. Often the youth will isolate themselves. It's harder to communicate with teenagers. Do you have any tips? Many teachers have contacted us and asked for training. Last summer, I was at a school and a male student said he didn't know why he was listening to the teacher because she was just a woman. That's been reported back to us. So there's clearly an issue of teachers who don't know how to deal with that subject, and it creates divisions between male and female students. And we need to support them. I talked about a national crisis. Madame Clermont-Dion said that she agrees with that. Is this just the tip of the iceberg? What's happening at the moment? I think what we're hearing about is horrible. Is it just the tip of the iceberg? We should be upset. We have to be worried about the situation because there are terrorist attacks linked to the manosphere. That's a concrete violent act. In the conferences and the trainings I've done, I was surprised by how many teachers said that they were exposed to this discourse in their daily work. Do you think that we're experiencing a national crisis? I think there's a high risk, for one, and in risk communication, we want to prevent the crisis, and at the moment, we have the luck to be able to prevent the crisis. I'm going to go quickly. Am I right in thinking, I think I read that somewhere, that women who support this kind of, it's quite surprising. Yes, I have a student who works on female influencers who share anti-feminist messaging and all kinds of content that's sometimes linked to other violent ideology. There are women who share those messages. Are there women's groups who organize together and who support this messaging? Oh, is my time up? No. 20 seconds. Yes, there are women's communities who share that content, who give each other platforms, and that's the issue with social media. They create networks, and so one influencer gives another influencer, and they create online ecosystems. And in real life, they support each other. Yes, Andrew Tate is followed by many men, but also by women. Thank you. And that's the end of your time. Madame Menard, over to you for 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. I'd like to get deeper into this subject. This study came out of a motion that I tabled. This summer, I spoke with a high school teacher. She was horrified to admit that she had had more than one conversation with first and second year high school students, 13 and 14, young girls who told her that they didn't see the point of studying because they were destined to raise their children. And the teacher questioned them. She said, okay, and why? is this an identity project? And the young girls just said, it'll be easier. Clearly in this committee, we've talked about the impact that it has on young men and on LGBTQ plus groups. What's happening with young women due to this anti-feminist movement? Madame Carignan, multiple things. There are studies that show that it normalizes violence towards women. Women will perhaps minimize the violence they undergo more. And we're going backwards. There's a misunderstanding of what feminism is. Women will also think that feminism is a bad thing and that it'll deregulate society. Madame Lorenzetti, you talked about the fact that online spaces are sometimes outside of real life or in-person life. Is it the government's place to continue to support community organizations that create real life spaces where there's the possibility of a dialogue? Thank you. I'll respond in English because it's a bit easier, but thank you.
That, we need to have protections online. And the Harms Protection Act, a bill that was brought forward, I think it still needs to be finalized and put through. We need protections, we need policies, but at the same time, what alternatives are we providing for youth? I think that is, everyone is busy, everyone's making money, parents are up to here, and at the same time, young people are spending more and more time online. I mean, I think 9 hours in the teen group. You've read that, I'm sure, in the stats. And so what alternatives are we providing? And I do think the leadership from the government to say there's opportunities here. There's positivity out here. There's community out here. There's things that you can do and build and be part of outside of the online environment. It's not that we're going to take youth offline. That's not going to happen. But at the same time, what are the positive alternatives that we're offering?
Merci beaucoup. Je vais complètement ailleurs.
Thanks very much. Madame Carignan, you're interested in media. When there are politicians with large followers and they insult female journalists and degrade them with no shame, politicians have used the hashtag men going their own way. What's the impact on society of that? All those discourse in mainstream media normalize discourse that ought not to be, and they make unacceptable discourse acceptable. When we're looking into how to deal with different extremisms, the theory of the Great Replacement, before it was on the margins, it was a conspiracy theory, and now it's a societal debate. So the same goes for anti-feminist debates. And people just casually use these formerly marginalized ideas. Anything to add, Madame Lorenzetti?
Role model. We're the role models of compassionate leadership. We see authoritarian role models, strong men role models. So if it can work for people who empower and they gain more power, why can't it work for me? That's the question that people are asking themselves. Young people are seeing what's happening. We can talk all day long, but what are we modeling for young people? What are we giving them as alternatives? So that's important to consider.
Merci. Oh, vraiment? Formidable, formidable.
Perfect. We talked about social media. We're talking about regulation. Are you talking about a legal regulation? Yes, I think there needs to be a regulatory framework regarding hate speech online. Young women and youth in general is at risk, and everyone. I think the online social media platforms also ought to have a responsibility. After the pandemic, platforms put some moderation measures in place, and they've been abandoned since. So the platforms need to take their responsibilities regarding hate speech. There need to be overall strategies to make sure platforms are more responsible. Have there been any models that we could follow internationally? Well, Australia and the UK's models are interesting. They could be considered. We have to think about how some countries can work together to pressure major platforms. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Madame LaRouche, over to you. 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you very much to our two witnesses. You've confirmed the extent to which this is a major issue. First, I'll address my questions to Madame Carignan. I studied at the University of Sherbrooke, so I'm very interested in your work. That said, it's very worrying, but I'll ask some complementary questions. First, your colleague, Mr. Morin, talked about a war of the sexes. There were influencers, and tout le monde en parle, and we also saw trad wives. And so that's complementary to this discourse. When we're talking about two women who are supporting these anti-feminist, meninist movements, well, that was demonstrated when they went to that TV show, Tout le monde en parle. Can you speak to that? Well, trad wives that went on Tout le monde en parle, they weren't really online influencers. They were conservative women. I think the term trad wife is a bit confusing. At the moment, my colleague Nadine Vincent is looking into whether or not they should be called traditional women because there's an ideology behind them. The trad wife influencers are specific. They say that feminism can be a problem. So these were rather women who decided to stay home. And that's a legitimate choice. Same goes for men. But the issue is that they're influencers who want to get more followers, and when they have extremist discourse, that can be problematic. People are mixing everything up and use that and associated that to that movement. That's what came out of the comments. Traditional media. There was an ad for Radio Canada in the last budget, but funding is more than that. It's private and community media. And if we don't take money from GAFAMs, from people coming here who aren't paying their fair share, in any case, we need a diversity of media. Why is a diversity of media important? It's important because at the moment, there are communities that have hardly any local communities. So when there's a crisis in the community, well, they need local news. Often the first information source is local media, so it must be funded at all levels so that communities can be more resilient. It's key. In Sherbrooke, there were several local media outlets that denounced the fact that they didn't have the funding in order to work properly. So we can see the key role of those news outlets so that disinformation isn't propagated. Yes, there are fewer and fewer resources, especially for community media outlets. As a former journalist, I can understand that they simply can't explain things to those in their community. Those media outlets need resources. And it's also worrying because many people get informed via social media platforms where there is misinformation. So I'm very worried. There was a poll that came out, or there was a study that showed that a lot of Canadians get their news from Facebook and Instagram, even if there's no longer any news on those platforms. But people are still getting their news from there. So they find anti-feminist influencers, among others, and they're giving misinformation. So some people confuse professional media with misinformation. We're also seeing cyber violence, And there was a documentary. And the person who did the documentary asked the federal government to get involved for there to be a regulatory framework regarding cyber violence. Your colleague, Mr. Morin, worked on C-63. Why is it important to have a law in that regard? Finally, when we're talking about online hatred, reducing, or rather removing the exemption for religion in hate speech, because religion can often be linked to that traditional point of view. It's important because online hate speech can push people to be violent, and it can lead to breaching other rights and freedoms. For that, you need a regulatory framework, a bit like media is regulated. They can't commit libel and things like that. Online hate speech must be regulated, especially hate speech that can bring to violent actions outside of the online sphere. We have to think about how to regulate that content. It's tricky. However, there's no doubt that it's easy to regulate hate speech and cyber porn online that targets youth. We need to regulate, absolutely.
Round of questions. We'll start with Ms. Roberts for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you both for being here. This is an important study where we could all learn. So I'm going to ask my first question to Mrs. or Miss Lorenzetta? Doctor, scusa lei? Mi scusa. Perdone, perdone. So anti-feminist movements openly advocate for traditional gender roles, keeping women in unpaid, undervalued caregiving roles and financial dependence. Given that 80.6% of Canadians cite food as their main financial pressure, 28% are focused to use savings to go into debt, and over 25% experience food insecurity. Would you say that the current economic realities are reinforcing women's dependence in ways that these movements seek to exploit?
Well, I think the movements are definitely exploiting the anxiety. That's for sure. And the feeling of where's my future? The idea I talked about earlier, humanity's doomed. And so what should I do? And so I think in talking with some of my young students, I mean, it's interesting because the trad wife movement, for me, it was naturally looked upon as an anti-feminist movement, right? It's anti-feminist, it's hateful, etc. And then some of the young women were saying to me, yes, but we're overwhelmed. We're exhausted. We're not sure where to put our energies. And so this gives us one option, right? So it's like an option for women. I think the economic crisis that's deeply impacting young people is part of the solution. It can't be separated from the solution, because I think that the more options that women have, the less they might feel likely, to engage in a relationship that's not going to give them a voice.
So I want to make it clear, my late husband always said to me that beside every successful woman, every successful man, there's a woman. And I remember after losing 5 children, he brought me this book to the hospital. And he said to me, I want you to always read this to our children, male or female. And the book was by a very famous author, which I'm sure everybody knows, Robert Munch. I Love You Forever. And that was a book that I used to read to my children, both my son and my daughter, to educate them both, that irregardless whether you're a male or a female, the respect of both genders is very critical, because if you don't respect yourself, then you can't respect anyone else. So my question to you is, in the past session, we had women here that come from different cultures that have different beliefs, and they are dominated by the men. So from your experience in shelters and social work, how do economic pressures and gender norms intersect to make women more vulnerable to abuse?
They absolutely do. They absolutely do. The choices are limited. I think that when women don't have access to economic well-being, the choices are limited. And for me, it's not about enforcing one way or another about how women live their relationships. I also love that book as well. And it is about the constraints that women feel to have to make choices that they're not comfortable with. So I don't come here advocating for a certain way of life for women and girls, for Two-Spirit, and men either. It's about opening those spaces where there can be choices. And as long as you have systemic violence, you have economic violence in a sense of deprivation, which I think is a form of violence as well, then you're not going to have those choices. And I think that we need to take into consideration how deepened that is for communities that are already marginalized. Migrant communities, communities that are working, 2-3 jobs, communities that are being now, called outsiders or being cast aside. I think that's really important to think about when we think about the roles for women.
Within the last 30 seconds that I have, I want to thank you for your comments, because I will tell you I was in a male-dominated profession previous to coming to Ottawa, and I have to tell you, my male colleague caucuses, I think they're kind of afraid of me, and I don't know why, but they're very respectful, and I can feel comfortable around them. So I think a lot of it, from a mother's point of view, we need to educate our male children and our females that everyone should be treated with respect.
Very good. And now we'll go to Mr. Chen for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the witnesses both. For Dr. Lorenzetti, you said in your testimony, misogyny generates enormous profits. Could you elaborate and tell us more?
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much. And I think there's a lot of research out there. That's not my area of research, but I have been online and I have seen the products that are being sold. I mean, young men's insecurities are being weaponized in ways that they're willing to spend money. And I mean, I would say as a woman in my 50s, I've seen that, right? That has been a reality for women for a very long time. How much money can you spend? The looks maxing movement, how are you going to get a date? How are you going to be somebody that women want? I think there's an association between that looks maxing, the sale of men's well-being through whatever it is. Sometimes it's protein powders and a variety of other things that men need to engage in, fitness routines, and the connection with deprecating women. That's where the problem is, because fitness routines and well-being is not a bad thing. We all need those. But there's a connection between that and dominating. The domination is where the problem is. And that's why some men, especially young men, might, go into these websites because they want to, self-improvement. They're looking, they're looking for a purpose, or they want to get fit, etc. Little by little, you see that they're in this manosphere, so-called manosphere, where there's highly problematic ideologies associated with their well-being. In order to have well-being, you need to dominate. And this is where the problem is. So I'm sure and I'm able to provide some of that research if you're interested later on.
Thank you. So in terms of efforts, whether they are community-based or federal, to tackle anti-feminist ideology, you just spoke earlier about the impacts on migrant communities. And my question is, are these efforts enough to address the unique challenges and oppressions that are faced by BIPOC women or gender diverse women?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that the work we're doing in community, a lot of it which is connecting and training peer role models, men leaders. We were working with 7 or 8 ethnocultural communities who are then working with their daughters and sons and community leaders, et cetera, around healthy and nurturing masculinities. All of those are happening. They're also discussing their challenges as migrants, their challenges with systemic racism. They're getting together in their own languages through their own cultural practices to really find that community and solidarity. At the same time, what are we doing at a systemic level to address that? And so that's where I always, and you know, I've read the 231 calls to justice, that we've got anti-racism strategies, et cetera. We can't do this work in a silo. I've worked in women's work for a long time, and I found it quite siloing. And I thought to myself, there's other strategies and plans that need to get involved in what we're doing here. So I think as much as we are trying to expand this community-based, culturally resonant work with men, in particular around fatherhood and role modeling, at the same time, there needs to be policies that give people hope, and they have to be based on equity, decolonization, and anti-racism.
So speaking on decolonization equity, I'll turn to Dr. Kerrigan. Can you explain the risk of downplaying or undermining diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives? What impact does that have?
What do you mean? Do you mean if I...
Well, in terms of your research on misinformation and on the societal impacts of that misinformation, when EDI is undermined or downplayed, what happens next?
Ouais. Ce qu'on voit dans nos recherches sur la désinformation.
Our research on misinformation has shown that many influencers will play with insecurity, marginalization, feeling excluded. Those three things are vulnerability factors. And many influencers, be they anti-feminist or other influencers, that promote conspiracy theories, will exploit those insecurities. And that's when people are looking for a feeling of social belonging and answers to their questions. And they'll hook into those insecurities to reel them in and make them distrustful of institutions towards traditional media. Thank you. Madame LaRouche, 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. Time is running out. I have so much to say. We spoke about influencers, Madame Carignan, in the TV show Tout le monde parle. But what about the alpha male documentary by Simon Coutu? That's talked about quite a bit. Has he had more followers after the documentary? In the documentary, we could see links that link to their social media profiles. That's a problem. We must find the right balance between discussing these issues, but we have to be careful how we do it in order to not give a platform to these influencers that'll get even more mainstream when they ought not to be mainstream, and when their ideas should not be considered acceptable. The alpha male subject is really important and ought to be spoken about, just like the documentary Je vous salue, salope. But there's a certain way to do it. And that brings us to think about the role of the media and what journalistic practices we ought to have. It's a good example of two different documentaries. When I'm talking about journalism, I think it's a great example. I was interested in that study. I went to a high school class and I worked with a teacher. We can see the anti-LGBT discourse as well. She talked about diversity with her students. And she said she put up a gay pride flag, and when she came back to class, it was removed. How are these movements, for instance, white supremacy, anti-LGBT discourse, how are these radical ideas contributing to anti-feminism?
That's your time, Madame LaRouche. I think if you want to respond and send your answer to the clerk, that would be fine. We're going to go now to Ms. Cody for 5 minutes.
Hi, and thank you for coming. Everything goes really fast. So I'll start with the questions. Madam Carignan, you stated there's a misunderstanding of feminism. And in the absence of an official definition in Canada for anti-feminism, in your view, does this not contribute to confusion and frustration that could lead to anger and violence?
Because there's no definition of anti-feminism, you mean?
Correct.
Yeah.
The experts have not been able to agree on a definition. So since there's a lot of confusion on definition, could that contribute to a lot of the confusion, frustration that leads to anger and violence?
Mais c'est certain que je pense que d'avoir une définition peut être...
I think having a definition could help dealing with the issue like terrorism or radicalization. It's hard to talk about these things, especially in the political and media sphere, because there's no universally agreed upon definition. So we can't always decide when we're dealing with certain institutions. So I think have a definition of anti-feminism can help to deal with the issue. It's a complex issue.
In our study, we are, required to come up with some recommendations based on the witnesses and the testimonies. But without data sets and definitions, how do we measure whether interventions actually reduce anti-feminist attitudes or if they create more resistance?
On a notamment, avec la charte, mis en place un projet qui s'appelle Preuve Impact.
The chair put in place a project that allowed us to show how we could use indicators when we had prevention projects in order to see how efficient they were. So there are all kinds of indicators we can use, especially if they're prevention projects are harder to measure, but we can use those to show that prevention is something that works.
Okay, so I'll move on to a question to Dr. Lorenzetti. Did I say that correctly? Yes. Perfect, thank you. From your perspective, how should fairness be applied when sex-based rights and gender identity rights conflict, particularly in relation to the concerns on risk and women's safety in public spaces?
Yeah, I know. I think that's an issue that's in discussion right now, and I'm from Alberta. I've seen quite a bit, and in fact, there's been, in my view, some harmful legislation that's been put in place that I find problematic. I think the overarching thing that I see here is the divisiveness in the politic. The divisiveness in the politic of win-lose instead of a conversation that looks after everyone and addresses the harms that are being done, and I think that there are ways of doing that. What's happening is the polarization that we see in our political forums is the polarization that we see, say, at the university. It's the same thing, and our young people are accepting that. They're either on one side or another, instead of looking after one another. And I think there are some wonderful approaches in community that can be found that actually center a holistic approach instead of a win-lose. And I think that's up to us as adults and leaders to help uncover those approaches that are not a win-lose, that don't leave certain, especially marginalized communities, feeling like nobody cares about them.
So as violence towards women is increasing and there's a lot of fears and discomfort, we also have a lot of in our country culture expectations, and how should we ensure that women raising these safety concerns in their public spaces, which their private public spaces, are not being mischaracterized or dismissed, that their concerns are actually heard?
Well, I'm a woman who's concerned about safety as well. I think many of us are. And I think at the same time, if we're talking specifically about trans communities, two-spirit communities, gender nonconforming, the violence against those communities is actually much more even than what women are going through. The extent of violence against those communities, members of those communities, especially those youth, is quite high. And so I think
I want to redirect it back to women's public safety in public spaces, because that's where the concerns are being heard. I get a lot of letters in my community. They're very concerned about the universal change rooms and the requirements lacking as to who can enter. And so there's been situations that have been brought to my attention. I was just wondering, when it comes to the conflict between sex-based rights and gender identity rights, which will prevail in that situation?
So I'm not going to give a win-lose answer. What I will say is it's not members of the trans community that's actually creating those lacks of safety for women. If we look at the data, it's not those communities that are actually perpetuating the violence. So that's something that needs to be quite clear.
Thank you. Now we're going to go to Ms. Nathan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, through you, and thank you both for being here and answering our questions. So my question for Ms. Curigan is, from a communications perspective, what responsibility should political leaders bear in preventing the spread of narratives that undermines women's rights? So can you talk a little bit about political leaders, maybe more so in terms of the hate speech and defending that as a freedom of speech?
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question. Madame Ménard earlier mentioned politicians who have vulgar speech directed at women. If we normalize violent dialogue towards gender minorities, towards women, towards ethnic groups, well, then we're normalizing it at the social level. So political leaders have a duty to not normalize violence and also to denounce it when those things happen, because politicians are also exposed to this violent content. I have many colleagues who work on harassing directed towards female politicians, and there's very gendered content online that will be directed towards female politicians and scientists. I myself have been subject to that sort of harassment. And so institutions have to show they don't accept that.
Okay. And like we have political leaders going around speaking with young people. And in their speeches, it's more so an anti-DEI type of a narrative. Can you talk a little bit about how that would shape a young person's beliefs and going forward, how this may affect the society? Because we see this a lot in the U.S., and we are getting to see that more so now here as well.
Yeah.
What politicians say will serve as an example on social media platforms. Our studies and our online monitoring shows that discourse that marginalizes certain communities that are normalized by politicians, be they Canadian or from other countries, well, they're taken up online and they'll be used in order to justify their hate speech. And we can see what's happening in other countries that's taken up in Canada that's used to justify hate speech and online disinformation. So we must be really worried about what's happening elsewhere that has an impact here.
Thank you. And just wanted to speak a little bit about criminalizing hate speech. It's going through the Parliament right now, Bill C9. Can you talk about, it's needed, and that's why this bill is there, but can you talk about in context of youth, how they may be negatively affected by this, because they are being shaped by listening to all this in social platforms, and they are going to be negatively affected, I think, but I want to hear your opinion.
Je mentionnais tout à l'heure, très rapidement.
Earlier, I mentioned a study that came out in November in France. That study shows that youth under 18 are highly exposed to anti-feminist influencers and follow multiple anti-feminist influencers. Our data also shows that youth consume online content and follow influencers, and that influencers target youth. So there's a community of influencers that will target them to convince them to hurt themselves, commit suicide, and do harassment. So there are groups that really target youth. And if we don't regulate hate speech online, there's a risk, and there's a risk of an increase of these groups. There were recently arrests done against certain of these members. It's a real risk for vulnerable youth and who don't always have a capacity to be critical and analyze what's going on. They know how to push youth to commit acts of violence.
So much. That concludes our first panel. I want to thank our witnesses for your contributions today. I understand one of you is actually testifying at another committee like in about 5 minutes. So I'm going to suspend while we get our second panel ready. our second panel, if I could get everyone to come back to the table. Thank you so much. All right. So, Anna, thank you. So we have, as our witnesses for the second panel, Dr. Michael Kaler, Research Chair for Masculinity Studies and Education at the Workland School of Education at the University of Calgary. Welcome to you, sir. And from Be the Peace Institute, we have Sue Brookchin, the Executive Director, by video conference. So just a reminder to address your remarks through the chair and wait until I call you by name. And each of you will have 5 minutes for your opening remarks, and I will be ever so helpful. When you have 1 minute left, you get the yellow card. When you have 30 seconds left, you get the red card. And then I ever so gently say, and that's your time. So we'll start with you, Dr. Kaler, for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, and thank you to the committee for this invitation to provide testimony and respond to anti-feminist ideology. I'm honored to speak with you about a topic that has deeply impacted my life and motivated my research namely the intersection of masculinities and anti-feminist ideology. I speak to you today as a masculinity scholar whose research has spanned 25 years. At the same time, I speak to you as a father, a son, and a brother who has experienced firsthand the devastating effect of gendered pressures that impact boys and men in our gendered relationships. My dad died when I was 6 years old. My mother raised 4 boys. When I was 18, my older brother was in second year university at Queen's University in Commerce. He took his life at age 20. My dad took his life too. I've witnessed masculinity and the damaging impact narrow, restrictive versions of masculinity can have and are having at this critical point as we consider anti-feminist ideology. My research centers on masculinities, it centers on power, and it centers on the gendered interaction of youth, teachers, and the curriculum we teach, both in schools as well as in our faculties of education. In short, my research focuses on boys, men, and issues including, but not limited to, homophobia, gender-based violence, allyship, mental health, teacher education, and men as change agents. The research I've conducted examines the sociocultural context within which boys and men do boy, the ways boys and men perform and express masculinities, not because of their biology, but because of their choice. In 2018, the American Psychological Association updated its guidelines to reflect a growing body of research showing how masculinity is not biologically fixed, but socially constructed, meaning boys and men are shaped by the environments and pressures around them. And it's not simply boys being boys. Boys and men navigate and negotiate power arrangements within and among men, determining which forms of masculinity are heralded, valorized, and validated, and which attitudes, behaviors about being men are discounted, marginalized, and ostracized. Men and boys are compelled to be among the boys. They want to be accepted, and men and boys are driven by fear, the fear of being perceived as less than a man. This is about men's insecurities and their inabilities to navigate different versions, restrictive versions of masculinity. Anti-feminist ideology is not new. What is new is the levels at which and the spaces and places in which we increasingly witness anti-feminist views being expressed openly, publicly, and indeed with a degree of entitlement not seen in quite some time. There is an upsurge in boys and men whose views, attitudes, and beliefs about being men are taking hold and spreading both in our classrooms, on playgrounds, in locker rooms, in sports arenas, and yes, on the internet and the manosphere. The recent Netflix shows, Adolescence, offers a snapshot of the intersecting issues we witness when we consider anti-feminist ideology. The manosphere, a series of online spaces that promote and distribute anti-feminist beliefs and attitudes, are yet another digital space where anti-feminist ideology goes unchecked, driven by far-right leaning politics, claiming that men and boys need to take back power, assert dominance, and control. We need to disrupt, challenge, and interrogate these pressures to endorse, conform to, and perform dominant masculinity. And in doing so, we need to also acknowledge that men and boys have agency to be unlike the rest of the boys. The manfluencers of the internet are promoting hate, dominance, and violence that suggest men reclaim and reassert dominant narrative masculinity. Far-right anti-feminist messaging that suggests that men are being left behind because of women and because of minorities further widens an ideological gap between the sexes that blames women and gender equality as the source of all evil. What we need to do is be mindful of this crucial conversation about anti-feminist ideology is the damaging and damaged ways that hate and discrimination is being seeded within and among boys and men. We need to be aware of the power of these attitudes and behaviors among men and boys that attempt to reclaim what appears to be entitled male privilege. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we'll go to Ms. Bookchin for 5 minutes.
Hi, thank you so very much. The organization I'm executive director of is a nonprofit based in rural Nova Scotia, wholly committed to ending gender-based violence and dismantling the systemic and social forces that keep it in place. I'd like to speak about the convergence of some of the forces that I think are making young people particularly vulnerable in these polarizing times. Sexualized violence and exploitation, the availability of online pornography, extremist ideologies that are highly misogynistic and linked inextricably to gender-based violence and also mass casualties, and the online sphere as the primary vehicle for these dynamics. A gendered lens is needed because the girls and gender diverse youth are most at risk of harm, and the harm is not exclusively, but primarily being committed by males who are being conditioned into a normalization of misogynistic violence. The Mass Casualty Commission here in Nova Scotia, in their final report, talked about a strong connection between stereotypical views of masculinity and perceived threats to masculinity with gender-based violence and mass violence committed by males. Misogyny is a common trait among perpetrators of mass violence. Among other causative factors, anti-feminist and extremist views appear in their writings, manifestos, or online activity. And the hallmarks of the incel movement, which people have talked about, include overt hatred of women, belief that they don't deserve respect, security, or equality. It's founded in male supremacy, and the UN identifies misogyny as a gateway to other forms of extremism. In the manosphere, and people have talked about this as well in online spaces, are a vehicle for grooming young men into these ideologies. We hear about an epidemic of loneliness and isolation, particularly for boys. And as gender roles shift toward greater equality and representation of women, boys and young men are searching for their place. This can propel them into the online spaces, looking for a sense of community and belonging, where they find social media influencers like Andrew Tate and his extreme misogynistic, hypermasculine views, hateful speech, sexual violence and exploitation, and far-right ideologies. He has millions of followers, primarily young men and boys. In a recent CSIS news release, it is increasingly true that children and youth are being pulled into violence motivated by extreme ideologies and worldviews, and this is accelerated by technology and online platforms. In White Ribbon's recent report, Boys Are at Risk, they found that 75 to 95% of educators and youth professionals have seen radical ideologies expressed by boys and men. They're concerned about harmful online content that is targeting young boys, and they've witnessed misogynistic behaviors in the classroom. In Nova Scotia, the Auditor General put out a report about violence in Nova Scotia schools and found an increase of 60% over the past 7 years, and that has severe and lasting consequences. It did not have a gender lens as far as I could see, but violence in the form of bullying, cyberbullying, discriminatory behavior is influencing a dramatic increase in absenteeism and school avoidance across Canada. Again, this compounds isolation and anxiety, and young people may turn to online spaces and gaming for a sense of community where the algorithms pull them deeply into the kinds of extremist ideologies. In the book, The Anxious Generation, the author, Jonathan Haidt, talks about how the mental health of adolescents has plunged, primarily through the arrival of phone-based childhoods. Rates of depression, anxiety, self-harm, and suicide rose sharply in the last decade in this era of smartphones and social media and big tech, which is influencing the social and neurological development of our children. Online pornography is not being talked about much. It is hijacking children's brains. What used to be called hardcore is now normalized. It's inherently misogynistic and shockingly violent toward females, and males and females are learning to accept and normalize this behavior. It changes their brains. It wires together sexual activity and violence and grooms young people to be desensitized to sexualized violence. And on these sites, predators also lurk. This has been called a public health emergency. And the pornography industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. In a pediatric grand rounds that was hosted by the IWK hospital, I was horrified at the alarming statistics about child-on-child sexualized violence, the addiction of
Thank you.
teens.
Sorry, that's your 5 minutes. We'll get to the content, I'm sure, in the questions. Otherwise, if either of you have things that you would like to have said that you didn't get time to say, please feel free to send those bits of information to the clerk. We'll start our first round of questions with Madame Vienne for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much to both of you for being here today. We appreciate it very much. Mr. Keller. I'll give you time to put in your earpiece. Can you hear me? Do you have translation? Perfect. Is it working? Can you hear me? Perfect. Well, I hope you won't count that time. Thank you very much, Mr. Keller. Anti-feminism exists, and it's existed for a while. How is it possible that over the last 10, 15 years, it's risen? How did it get so big? How did it increase to this extent, that is, anti-feminism among our boys and young men? How is it that it's exploded to this extent? Is it only because of the internet access, the rise of online platforms, or are there other reasons? Are there other ways to explain it?
Pardon, is the interpretation, or am I mistaken?
While we fix the translation. Est-ce que vous
Mr. Keller, I'll go a bit more quickly. You've all heard my question already. how is it that anti-feminism has existed for quite some time now? How is it possible that it's exploded to this extent? How has this phenomenon increased like this? Is it only because there are more and more online platforms, there's internet that's more and more accessible, or according to you, are there more underlying reasons why anti-feminism and Meninist discourse has risen to this extent?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think what we need to acknowledge is the fact that in many ways, I think we become complicit in anti-feminism, that we've allowed for this uprising, we've allowed for different spaces, locker rooms, misogyny. Again, we've seen misogyny, we've seen bullying, we've seen anti-feminist ideologies in many spaces for a long time, and what we are seeing is an uprising among the far right, who is reclaiming sort of the masculinist sort of perspective. And I'm not saying it's ever gone away. I think it's just been sort of simmering underneath what one might argue is a more woke sort of environment in which we now operate. And in the same time, I think many boys and men feel they need to be able to speak up and speak out. And I think we have allowed this to happen because we haven't had clear policies. We haven't explicitly spoken to masculinities in education, for example.
Dites-moi, Monsieur Keller,
Mr. Keller, could you send us any data pertaining to public opinion on these issues? Are there data on this issue? Do people really think that it exists? And are people not worried about it? Do we have data? Have we measured the awareness of the public regarding this issue?
I can certainly follow up with percentages and numbers. I do know internationally, when I think about my colleagues in Australia and the UK, here in Canada, the rising within education specifically, the anti-feminist ideology that is perpetuated within schools. I'm currently doing a national study with teachers across Canada, male identifying teachers, and I was in fact in Manitoba last week, and some of the incidents some of the incidents where the teachers have said that the boys make homophobic remarks or sexist remarks against girls. I also have a daughter who is a physical health education teacher who talks about how some of the boys will speak back to her until she tells them that that's disrespectful and puts them in their place for disregarding her as a woman. And so, indeed, I can follow up with statistics. Yeah.
That's very, very relevant, and I look forward to you sending our data. The data. I look forward to receiving your data. In terms of the education sphere, we don't have positive male role models, because there aren't very many male teachers. And so there aren't very many male role models. Maybe there's dad, grandpa. It might just be limited to that. Should we make more of an effort to have more positive male role models in the lives of youth to prevent them from looking towards this online discourse?
I appreciate what you're saying. I would be very cautious about saying simply more male role models will solve the problem. We've seen that attempted here in Ontario in the past, where the previous one of the governments has tried to encourage more male teachers and actually provided or tried to provide a financial incentive. This I do not believe, and the research would bear out, it is not strictly the gender of teachers that will influence our youth. It is the pedagogical practices of teachers. So however they identify, we need to be very cautious about saying we simply need more male teachers as male role models. I think that I think that disregards the agency that children have in the classroom. They do not look across and strictly see a female or a male, or however the teachers identify. They are engaged by teachers and teachers' practices in classrooms.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And now we'll go to Ms. Khalid for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I'll be honest with you, over these number of meetings that we've had on this study, I've been a little perplexed. What I hear again and again, in more of a, I guess, an unconscious bias type of way, is witnesses and experts coming forward and finding excuses rather than accountability to say, oh, well, maybe it's social media. Oh, well, maybe it's indoctrination. It's the incel movement, the MAGTOW movement. Oh, it's this, it's that, it's that. Well, where's the accountability? Dr. Keller, do you think that women who have been suffering violence against them for generations, ever since the dawn of time, I would say, do you think that they get that same leverage, that same, I guess, ability to be a victim, instead of to say now all of a sudden that this movement has come across and that we're now so woke in many senses to say that, oh no, actually our boys and men, they are victims. They're the ones that are being, indoctrinated. Can you comment on that, please? Tell me how we can help solve this.
Let me try to respond. That was a beautifully loaded question. But in many ways, I'll try to respond. I do think that what we need to, and I tried to say in my opening comments, is we need to acknowledge that boys and men have power and control. They have agency to change their attitudes and behaviors, and they are responsible for their actions. And we need to be very careful about allowing them just to be boys. And so in many ways, I think what we need to is lean into these conversations with boys. And we need to, if it's uncomfortable, then that's uncomfortable, and they need to embrace that and understand how uncomfortable it is for others. So I hope I'm responding to your question, and I do think that as educators, as teachers, as parents, we have a responsibility to demonstrate what respect looks like. We have a responsibility to show fairness in the classrooms. I was in a classroom again just recently where a youth described to me an incident of bullying that occurred in a locker room where another child was pummeled with balls and homophobic remarks cast at him. After that talk, the child who was in that same room sought me out, and he said, Michael, he said, I was that child that had the ball thrown at me. I was the one who was ostracized. And he expressed to me his appreciation for me actually acknowledging the kind of bullying that occurs in our schools and in those locker rooms. And so what I'm saying to you is this child, for me, embraced and acknowledged. He named himself in that context. And so I do think that what I've seen and know from both as I used to be a high school English teacher, as a researcher, as a parent, the abilities we have to engage youth and to take on responsibility for their actions, and also to own what they do.
And Dr. Keller, I have 3 brothers. I'm the only daughter in my family, and I have 3 nephews also. Common sense is that you don't hurt somebody. It's in my family. That's kind of how it goes. I've had wrestling matches with my brothers, no issues. We go about it that way because we don't consider gender to be a differentiator within my family. And I appreciate that common sense approach within the classroom, within how we operate as a society. But when we create, and have over the past 100 years created, an old boys club, and now over these decades where we've seen the Me Too movement, we've seen the Epstein files, we've seen the MGTOW, the incels, I don't think that this is something that is created now. I think this is something that's just now coming to light to say, well, this exists. What do you think as a society, as a government, that we can do to combat that old boys club mentality to make sure that there's equality of opportunity for everybody?
Yeah, again, I agree with you. I think that we need to be very intentional and purposeful in how we challenge masculinities, plural, and how we take up masculinities in our schools. The absence of conversations around a lot of conversations around different forms of masculinities in and of itself, its invisibility in schools, just as, for example, and I've mentioned to the Ontario provincial government and education about the lack of attention to body image issues that adolescents, boys in particular, confront as well. The lack of awareness, the lack of conversations, the lack of support for teachers and educators to take up these issues, I think is an area that we, the government needs to pay particular attention to. And it's not simply throwing money at it.
Sorry,
but it's
that's
also
your time on this question. So we'll go now to Madame LaRouche for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. During this study, we've realized that we're getting into what's causing violence, and I'd like to go a bit deeper with you. Madam Bookchin, what community initiatives were efficient in order to prevent anti-feminism and misogyny?
I'm not sure I would use the term efficient. This is a complex and wicked problem, and many community organizations and in partnerships are trying to find ways to tackle this. Recently in Nova Scotia, there is a new curriculum that has come out that will be in grades primary to grade 12. And then there is more initiative about universities, about violence prevention and healthy relationships. But it will take time not only to bring that to all those grade levels in developmentally appropriate ways, but also ways to train teachers so that they feel comfortable with the material. This kind of work often gets delegated to a teacher who has time in their schedule, as opposed to people who are specially trained to engage youth in some of these very sensitive conversations. And I think there's also an initiative called Guys Work here that is a way for boys to be engaged together in school time to talk about these questions about masculinity and the things that can often be normalized. And that seems to have some promise. But I think it's a generational change. The forces that are coming at our young people from so many different directions are some of them addictive in nature. The algorithms do that online. There are also programs called Caring Dads, which is working who have children about how to be better fathers. And so there are a lot of initiatives. Something that I find we don't have a lot of are longitudinal studies about if we do this program in schools in grades primary to 6, let's say, how are we following those children over the course of their adolescence to see if that makes a difference for them. So we try a lot of different things, but I don't think we have a lot of good data and long-term research about what works.
That's what we were told earlier by the UNESCO chair in the prevention of radicalization. They said that that was one of their recommendations, to invest in that data and do more research. We can see a few solutions. There's things that can be done. What ought to be funded on a priority basis by the federal government in order to counter online misogyny? Is it funding more research, regulating what's said online? What's your opinion?
I think that, like many people who have spoken about the need for legislation and regulation, I think it's essential to look at those possibilities and to legislate definitions of and accountabilities for hate speech. Big tech companies are getting away with pretty much no accountability for the harms that are being caused to young people. So I think that is an area that needs to be followed. And the initiatives that often happen through community-based organizations, often in the women's sector, the gender-based violence sector, but also some men's programs, are initiatives that get a small pot of funding for a year or 2 years or 3 years, and then the funding ends, and so there's a gap and not the ability to do that longitudinal work. So the whole sector that is dealing with young people needs to be funded in a much more sustainable and robust way. And I think we need also a lot more supports in schools, because this is a very, very complex time and vulnerable time for all youth, not just the youth that we think of as more vulnerable. All youth are vulnerable to these forces. And the teachers, the assistants, the administrators are often talking about how they don't have the necessary supports to deal with some of the things that are coming up in schools that they don't have the skills to be able to deal with.
You spoke of certain models here. Are there models abroad that you've looked into? Models that could give us certain solutions?
I have heard of and seen some models. I haven't followed them robustly, so I couldn't point to a particular place in the world, but I know Australia is doing quite a bit of work. The UK has instituted some legislation. I'm not sure how that is working. One of the suggestions was that all new technological devices should have an opt-in feature for accessing pornography, as opposed to having it readily available on any device to children, and also ways to enforce age limits on the things that can be harmful for youth.
Very good. Now we'll go into our second round of questioning, and we'll begin with Ms. Cody for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, through you. I'd like to direct my questions to Dr. Kaler, is it? Okay, thank you for coming today. I'm hearing through this study that viewpoints are being influenced by social media and narratives. And you also mentioned here today that boys are shaped by the environment around them. So has any research been completed on whether DEI messaging or the generalization of framing men and boys as a whole as harmful and toxic might actually be pushing some toward anti-feminist views and influencers?
I can't state specifically, cannot state specifically about any studies at this moment. However, you use the term toxic, and I will say the research abounds in terms of the disuse of the term toxic, which basically essentializes all boys and all men is problematic, and so in doing so, it sort of lays the rest with the individual as something that's inwardly grown and outwardly expressed. So you'll notice in any work that I've done, I actually find that language problematic because of what it actually feeds into men and boys as naturally violent, naturally aggressive. Right?
So We know many men find their only community and refuge in faith-based settings, places where they can talk, be vulnerable, and get support. But we also see rising public fears that government is moving toward policing or restricting certain religious expressions. How do we avoid creating deterrence on the very spaces where men feel safe and comfortable seeking help?
Yeah, I think that is a challenge. There's a tension there in terms of how we support diversity of masculinities, whether they're faith-based. And I do agree with you that I think we need to be very cognizant of the fact that there are spaces where boys and men need to be able to be vulnerable, to be open, and to be unsure of themselves, as opposed to being judged and devalued for that. So I agree with you, and I don't have an answer in terms of how do we allow for faith-based spaces. However, I do think that we do need to find ways to support diverse masculinities.
Thank you. I'd like to direct my next question to Ms. Bookchin. How are you today? Given concerns raised by women in agencies like Canada Border Services Agency about internal complaint processes, do you believe government should apply the same scrutiny to its own systems as it does to social attitudes?
Absolutely.
Well, that was quick. Thank you. I'll go on to the next question.
I'd also, because people mention what happens in politics and in the House of Commons or our legislatures, I think it also has to be said that those are workplaces that, if they are supposed to be healthy workplaces, we must address the misogynistic kinds of comments that come at women and figure out how we can address the kind of cyber vitriol and hate and gendered language that is used, particularly directed at female elected officials. So I think it does need to happen everywhere in government as well.
So in the absence of an expert agreed upon definition, anti-feminism is described as systems or attitudes that harm women. So would you agree that unresolved workplace harassment inside these federally regulated agencies should fall underneath that description or definition?
I think they certainly could. I think a lot of it is about harassment and gendered harassment. So adding that particular gendered lens, so a gender-based intersectional analysis is needed in those kinds of situations. And I would also say that in the ways that many institutions and systems use non-disclosure agreements inappropriately to silence women who are being harassed and violated is another huge issue that we should address.
Safeguards do you believe should be mandated within federal enforcement agencies to prevent supervisors from using pregnancy, medical leave, or caregiving responsibilities as grounds for sidelining or penalizing employees?
Yes, absolutely. We thought we had that handled, but apparently not.
Okay, and I think, nope, no more time left.
That's it for you.
So quick.
Now we're on to Madame Menard for 5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Keeler, I was very touched by your opening remarks. I found you generous and brave. What you mentioned that you could have kept to yourself, I think that goes to show that it's possible to be vulnerable in society. It would be a good thing. We managed to get people together to fight against racism. Would it be possible to get young men involved in the fight against the hatred that is anti-feminism?
Yeah, the short answer, yes. We can see that with, for example, men, for example, rallying around Movember, for example, the White Ribbon Campaign. We can see that there are organizations that are engaging boys and men. What we do not have here in Canada, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, we do not have a comprehensive strategic framework across Canada for engaging boys and men. We have nothing that is cohesive, coherent, and it does seem to me that this is what we need across our country, to say we are serious about engaging boys and men, and I would echo what was mentioned earlier, is that funding for engaging boys and men has gone up and down. And, you know, I admittedly have been a recipient of some of this funding. However, it's not an ongoing part of a national focus. And so the answer is definitely. And I do think that we need to create opportunities, and we need to allow boys and men to see the strength and courage in our vulnerabilities and not feel that they will be threatened.
Rêvons un peu. On a encore le droit.
We still have the right to dream. We're in a federation. It's not always easy to get all provinces and territories together behind a common project. Often what we first hear is the distinction of each one of those territories. What could we imagine nationally and dare to dream?
Yes, I again appreciate that. I moved to Alberta 8 years ago from Ontario, and I have learned even more so in those 8 years to project my voice, to speak up on behalf of youth. And I think that, you know, there is a province in which diverse masculinities and diverse gender identities is constantly under attack. And so across our country, I think we can imagine the possibilities for validating diversity of masculinities and be cognizant of the fact that there is not just one way of being a boy or a man, that there are many ways that we can express ourselves with respect and with regard for others.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Bookchin. À travers...
Thank you, Madame Bookchin. During the testimony we've heard in this study, the rise of anti-feminist ideology threatens democracy, threatens gender equality as well. So women are more likely to be victims of violence. Do you think we can also say that we're hurting the health of youth?
Well, I think the research certainly highlights that youth are struggling. Their mental health is struggling. The rates of anxiety and depression and self-harm are at a level we've never seen before. And so it is hurting youth. And we need to be very mindful of how whatever we do affects them, and how we also... We tend to focus on the risk factors for youth, and there are many, and I think we need to have a more public health, population health focus on what are the protective factors for helping young people to stay strong and resilient and healthy.
Selon votre perspective...
From your perspective, does that mean we also need to look into the rise of these ideologies as a health and safety issue?
You're on mute.
Sorry. Yes, it definitely is a health and safety issue, and not just for the individuals involved, but as we have seen in mass casualties, it spills out into the health and safety of whole communities. So I think these things are public health emergencies that we need to treat in that way and gather all our public health forces, health and mental health forces, to wrap services and supports and prevention modalities around young people, particularly when we think about young people in adverse childhood experiences. Those are indicators of potentially violent behavior later in life or potential victimization later in life. And that's when we should be acting.
Madame LaRouche, 2 minutes et demie.
Madame LaRouche, 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. Keeler, I was also very moved by your opening remarks. You expressed how important this issue is. To look into the causes of the rise of this issue and to avoid this turning into a war of the sexes, and really view it in that light. That is why, unfortunately, the last meeting in this study is coming up next week, but maybe we can come to an agreement, because listening to you, I wonder if we ought to prolong this study, and so I'm going to table a motion. Maybe we can decide together to prolong this study. We've realized that when we go deeper with the witnesses, that we can think of other witnesses. And so I propose that we add 3 additional meetings on this study in order to go deeper into the issues that this study has brought up, and that they be scheduled at the next availability in the agenda.
All right, we are on the topic of anti-feminism, so the motion's in order. Is there discussion on that motion? Ms. Khalid?
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick question. I don't want to prolong debate on this at all. Just wondering what the witness submissions would look like if we're extending the dates.
Just for the information of the committee, so we do have 2 panels Monday, and there were a number of witnesses that were called that weren't available that are still on the list. If we extend by 3 additional meetings, what that means is that we will not get to drafting instructions on the gender-based violence report or the anti-feminism report until we return in the new year. And of course, there are a number of other motions for discussion that we plan to talk about next Wednesday. Madame V.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Chair. My colleagues and I really deeply appreciate the current study. We are very committed. However, there are many other studies that are also in the works and other motions. We're not sure how we can fit 2 or 3 extra meetings into an agenda that's already full up. We're also waiting on 2 ministers who never came, and so we really need to move things forward. For those reasons, unfortunately, from this side, we do not agree with the motion. Given what we've heard and the we believe that we will have the necessary information to write our report. But I do understand the motion. We understand, but given the time that we have as a party, I don't think we have time for it.
Madame Menard.
Madame Menard, thank you to my colleague for her suggestions. I am really, really interested in this study. The more we learn, the more I realize that we must go deeper, and that this issue has ramifications on all the subjects that we're looking into here. I can also understand where Madame Vien is coming from. We have a lot of work to do. However, with this study has shown us all that we have yet to learn. So I agree with the motion, but I'm also aware of the fact that we're ambitious in this committee, and that's one of our strong points. But I really think that we get interested in something and realize how much we don't know. There weren't many precedents in this study. If we look into what was studied in the previous parliaments, I really think we're opening a new chapter. And given that I agree with the motion, I think we're really at the heart of something, and I think that 4 meetings is quite short.
Madame LaRouche.
The issue is that I can't... I'm aware of what the Conservatives are saying, but can I ask for there to be a compromise, perhaps 2 meetings, but I can't propose it. I can't propose an amendment myself for 2 extra meetings.
Hi. I really appreciate the motion, and I understand that in every conversation, we could probably spend a year on every single topic. And I've listened to a lot of the witnesses, and the information is amazing, it's full, and I think it's very complete. And the witnesses that we've heard for, it's basically a lot of the same information that has been shared. And I think that if we spend more time on this rather than some other issues that are concerned to the people we represent, that we might be missing other opportunities in moving forward. And the witnesses, we could talk forever and a day on this, but I think we need to move forward and get to the recommendations and the end of the study so we can actually start making some changes and move in a more positive manner and look at all the other issues and present our other motions so that we could actually expedite all the issues instead of spending so much time on one.
Je prends le risque dans cette...
I'll take the risk in the spirit of collaboration to table an amendment, a two-part amendment. And I'm very aware of what was mentioned by my colleague from the Conservative Party. Maybe move it down to 2 additional meetings and maintain the agenda that we have. So get into the draft report, the steps that we have on the calendar in order to not delay works that are currently underway, and have those 2 extra meetings after what's on.
Just to clarify, so then the amendment that Madame Menard is making is to go to 2 meetings and to strike the part that says at the next available opportunity in the calendar. We'll discuss that in our committee business on the next Wednesday. Madame Veen.
Est-ce qu'on peut s'exprimer sur la motion?
Can we talk about Madame Menard's amendment? Yes, I have a hard time understanding how we're going to fit in 2 extra meetings into our agenda. We can move things around. What are we going to move around?
When we start the session, when we come back, we would be adding those 2 meetings at that point in time and whatever other things we decide we're studying next year. Madame Larouche.
En fait,
So thinking about the agenda, next week, the subcommittee is meeting of the studies to come. That will end. Then we would have 2 reports to study, but I think we can go 1 report at a time. I think we can do 1, and then after the holidays, we can determine all of the witnesses. We can make an agenda, study 810, wrap up that study to not have 2 reports at the same time, because when we get back to the holiday, well, then otherwise we'd have 2 reports to study after the holidays. And so I think it would be difficult to study 2 reports after the holidays. So maybe we'll have 1 report on 810, and then we can wrap up the report on anti-feminism and even start the next study that we will decide next week.
So just
et peut-être même aussi avoir les 2 minutes.
And maybe even have the 2 ministers that we're waiting for, because they're supposed to come. I think it could be an opportunity to finish this report with the ministers who would come, to finish it with the ministers for 810, and finish the anti-feminism report, and then go to a new study.
Yes, and so both ministers have indicated that they will be available to come early in the new year. So do I understand correctly, Madame Larouche, that you agree with the amendment that Madame Menard has made to go to 2 meetings additional on this and stick with our existing calendar, but of course we wouldn't be drafting instructions on the anti-feminism report because that'll be after the 2 meetings in the new year. Is that clear? Is that correct? Very good. Madame Veen.
Là, moi,
We're losing the thread of things. We're adding things. We're meeting ministers. We asked to meet with the ministers, and are the ministers going to come faster than what we thought?
C'est-à-dire, ça change pas?
It's not changing. We didn't agree to seeing them Friday because we wanted to wrap up this study.
I've indicated that they will come in the new year, the last week of January or first week of February.
Mais, Madame la Présidente,
But, Chair, for 2 meetings on anti-feminism, as my colleague said, this isn't my first study here, and this behavior has repeated. It's not the witness's fault. That's the nature of the committee. Can Madame Larouche say exactly what she wants What exactly is she seeking pertaining to extra information?
4 rencontres.
4 meeting to explore the cause of hatred that's leading to the rise of hatred. Things pertain to laws online. We just opened a door towards traditional media. No one talked about that before. We're talking about funding, but funding for organizations that help men. We're at the beginning of a solution, and we can say it's too ambitious, but that doesn't change the arrival of the ministers. We've established the agenda. I think we can go even deeper, including for the ministers with 810. In order to undergo a complete study and have a bit more information, but I think the ministers should be prioritized because it's for the 810 study. If they can come quickly in February, then we can move around a witness meeting to finish up anti-feminism.
So the suggestion is that we go with the amendment of Madame Menard, and we can figure out the schedule in the next year. Ms. Cody.
A suggestion to the amendment, I believe Madame Menard had mentioned about these continuation of this meeting after some other items. Is that correct?
Yeah, the suggestion is that we try to fit the ministers in as soon as possible in the new year so we can finish that off, and then we would put these 2 meetings additional on anti-feminism.
Afterwards.
After that.
Okay, so then we're not going to do it beforehand. We're going to make sure. And could we then also look at other motions and everything to bring forward that are not being, so they're no longer postponed?
Yeah, we'll have a discussion next Wednesday on all the other motions that we want to figure out what order they will go in. And we'll have that discussion, I guess, next weekend or next Wednesday.
Yes.
Madam Nathan, did you have something to say? No? Okay. Well, then we'll call the question. So all in favor of the amendment of Madam Menard?
Specifically, please?
The amendment is that we will have 2 additional meetings on anti-feminism, and we are striking the part of Madame LaRouche's motion that says at the next available opportunity, so that we will be able to do other things first and decide our calendar together next Wednesday.
After the ministers come to appear?
I've called the question. So
that was my question, is the motion included that? And you said yes. So.
The motion doesn't specifically include that, although
And that's
the
the
discussion is
chair's
here.
prerogative
So
to schedule as
if you wanted to make a sub-amendment, it had to be made before we started voting the question. So on the question, all in favor of the amendment?
OK, go. Oui, c'est go, c'est parfait.
Oui.
Puis on va s'entendre après. OK, parfait.
Okay.
C'est bon.
All in favor of the motion as amended? Very good. Opposed? Okay, very good. So that's passed then. Apologies to the witnesses for the interruption of our committee business.
Yeah.
Madame Veen.
Merci. On a discuté que...
It's going quickly. We said we were going forward, okay. We have a condition to add 1 meeting with ministers that we're waiting on. But that's what we said.
You're not able to do that. When there has been an amendment made, you can make a sub-amendment. But if you don't make a sub-amendment, then when you begin to vote the amendment, you cannot then...
Madame la Présidente, on voulait faire un sous-amendement.
Chair, we wanted to propose a sub-amendment. That's exactly what Madam Cody did. Everyone understood. You understood, everyone understood we wanted to do a sub-amendment so that the ministers could come.
Ben, c'était pas formulé comme ça du tout.
It wasn't said in that way.
I want to make a sub-amendment. I'm
No.
sorry. So
No.
with that, I want to thank our
Moi,
witnesses.
sinon, on a des affaires du comité, Madame la Présidente.
But we have committee things to do. We are going to prioritize the minister's arrival. I agree with what you said, Dominique. I think next week, and I said I wanted it to be prioritized to wrap up 8:10 when the ministers arrive. Next week, we'll ensure that when we're talking about committee work and the agenda, it needs to be written somewhere. When we decide on our agenda, the minister's arrival is prioritized before the other studies. Otherwise, we'll wrap it up differently.
Agreement with the order, and so we'll make sure that it's recorded when we have our discussions about the order of committee business next Wednesday. Out of respect for the witnesses and their time, I very much want to thank you for coming. Obviously, we didn't get as much time to ask questions, so if there's something that you wanted to tell the committee, please send it to the clerk. We'd be happy to have all of your input, and thank you again for your time. With that, I'll adjourn the meeting.
Thank you so much.